I just realized that everyone has kind of been sleeping on next week's major Nintendo thing. Pokemon Champions. That's right. Pokemon Champions is coming out in the next couple of weeks on the 8th of April. And, in this era of everyone spurging out about not getting new Switch games and not getting new announcements and not getting a direct, it's very interesting how, actual releases, stuff like, say, Resident Evil Requiem, Pokemon Pokepedia, games like the Mega Man Star Force Collection, games like Virtua Fighter 5 Rebo, how all that's been, buried, all that's been completely ignored, so we can keep complaining about not getting directs. And now, we're getting Pokemon Champions. A month after Pokemon Pokepedia blew up the world, we're now getting Pokemon Champions exclusively on Nintendo Switch 1 and Switch 2. The mobile version doesn't come out until later in the year. So Pokemon Champions is coming out on Switch 2 this week. Okay, it is coming out on the 8th of April. And everybody is kind of downplaying it. Everyone's ignoring it. In fact, I don't really see a lot of people talking about it. I've seen people do entire spreadsheets of upcoming Switch software and just completely ignore Pokemon Champions. And a part of that is the general tendency to ignore games that are also on Switch 1 as well. But the simple fact of the matter is, first of all, if a game is on Switch 1, that does not mean it's not going to make Nintendo money, okay? Because I keep seeing people do this thing where they're just oh yeah, Metroid Prime 4 and ZA. Those don't count as Switch 2 games because they're also on Switch 1. That's not how this works, okay? ZA sold more on Switch 1 than it sold on Switch 2. Okay, I actually bought the Switch 1 version and then upgraded it to the Switch 2 version. I don't know if that, how that comes out in Nintendo's analytics, but, that is where we're at now. That's the reality of what we're seeing. That's the reality of the Switch 2 ecosystem, is that the Switch 1 is coexisting with the Switch 2. Switch 1 games are going to sell indefinitely, and I feel like a lot of people are really having problems processing this. A lot of people don't want to accept that Super Mario Bros. Wonder, a game that they wrote off and ignored 3 years ago, is now number 2 and 3 on the eShop, okay, because of the upgrade pack. Again, a game they wrote off and ignored and has already sold 20 million copies is a bestseller again. And it's it's kind of ridiculous to see how this plays out and how this happens. We saw Tears of the Kingdom get a resurgence of popularity recently. We saw Kirby and the Forgotten Land get re-released. We're seeing all the Mario Party Jamboree is regularly up there for Switch 1. Again, we're seeing these games continue to move units, and yet all of these business analysts and people seem to completely neglect the reality. They don't seem to understand what's going on at all. Is that well, the Switch 2 is obviously going to underperform because all they're getting is Switch 1 games. People haven't moved on from Switch 1. Yes, people are still buying brand new video games for their Switch 1. That isn't a bad thing. These people will adopt the Switch 2 eventually. This isn't complicated. Okay, this isn't a mystery. This isn't something that should be difficult to wrap your head around. But we are seeing Switch 1 games do really, really well even after the Switch 2 comes out. So Pokemon Champions, I think, is going to be a very, very strong example of this. I would argue the strongest example, because we're going into the hype cycle for this. And we're seeing the producer come out and just be we are going to continue supporting Pokemon Champions indefinitely. And that just kind of blows my mind, because they're saying that they're going to have this battle simulator, they're going to be tweaking it, they're going to be adding new content to it, they're going to be adding new Pokemon for it, they're going to be tweaking the mechanics, they're going to be adding in new features and aspects to it forever. And I feel like people really don't understand what that means. I feel like people really don't understand what they're doing with that game, because this means that, because of it being on iOS, because of it being on every Nintendo console, because of, constantly adding new Pokemon, this is going to be the battle simulator going forward. Making Pokemon Showdown obsolete, making, fan-made stuff, irrelevant, making, all of these, this game that's just going to be, there for Pokemon fans for, hardcore battles. I think their goal for this is to make this the competitive, Pokemon battle simulator. And that's very interesting to me because that's something I've always wanted since the Stadium days, is to like to expand on this concept. And it seems like this is what they've been building to. This is what they wanted, is that they wanted like this game that they could update indefinitely, add new features to, and keep people playing forever. And again, considering the success of Pokemon TCG Pocket, of Masters, of like Pokemon Go, like it should be very apparent where this is going. Where this is absolutely going to be a huge hit. And like what I don't understand is why the community seems to think this is going to be a giant nothing burger to the point where they're not bringing it up at all. Like, to me, it just feels like the industry is just ignoring a good chunk of these like massive releases. They ignored Pokepia before it came out. They ignored they're ignoring Pokemon Champions now, and they're ignoring Tamagotchi. Like I'm seeing people like clowning on Tamagotchi and calling it ridiculous and how it's not going to do anything. And yet like I think it's probably going to be like one of the biggest games of the year. Like I would argue it has potential to be bigger than Pokepia. Like people don't understand this. Like how big this game is for certain people, and like they're just completely clowning on themselves. They're exposing themselves as not knowing what they're talking about, and it's really coming through in their analyses and just their general behavior. Like the fact of the matter is they've been like ignoring so many upcoming Switch 2 games for so long that like the Switch 2 has no games is pretty much a complete joke. Like, honestly, I think Nintendo could just release that ad, like, Nintendo Switch has Nintendo Switch has games, and, like, slap a 2 on it, and, like, it would still be true and relevant today. You know what I mean? Like, again, the whole narrative that, like, the industry tried to introduce, that, like, the Switch 2 has no games, if you ignored all the exclusives, if you ignored all the Switch 1 games, if you ignored the third-party games, like, if you ignored the indie games, like, the Switch 2 has no games if you just disqualify everything on it that could be considered a game. Like, oh, man, I bought a console. What do you mean it didn't come with a game? What do you mean I have to buy my own? It's like, it's stuff like that. Okay, that's the reality of what we're seeing with Nintendo right now, is that people are just desperately downplaying everything they do, and they're very, very surprised when they realize, like what do you mean Super Mario Bros. Wonder has outsold Baldur's Gate 3? What do you mean that Tamagotchi Life was a huge success? What do you mean Pokepia is selling Switch 2s? Like, they just can't handle it. Like, they are in full damage control mode, and it's something that, like, everybody is really struggling with when it comes to like examining Nintendo success. Because like you can't really look at console and game sales anymore to get the full picture. Like you have to look at the Switch 1 sales. You have to look at the movie performances. You have to look at merchandise. And like when you start doing that, you realize that Nintendo's in a position where they can't possibly fail.